Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar from Markup to Magic, the evolution of Lightning components. We have a special speaker today. We have Greg Ruiz, who is who's presenting from the US. Greg is a director of product management for Lightning components, and I'd like to call him the master of Lightning components. Hi, Greg. Welcome to the webinar.
That's way too kind. now I'll have to live up to that. Hello, everybody, and I was about to say good evening, but I guess it is good morning for you. I'm in San Francisco.
Yes. All right. Okay. So before I hand over to Greg, a few items that I want you to know about. First of all, we have a product manager, director of product management, talking about his product. So there will be forward-looking statements. Don't make any buying decisions based on what we're going to talk about today, in case you are. And we're all up for social. Feel free to tweet us out on @Salesforce Devs on Twitter, Salesforce Developers on Facebook, LinkedIn. And you can also find all our awesome webinars and recordings and various other sessions for developers on our YouTube channel, Salesforce Developers. And please note, this webinar is definitely being recorded, and the video will be posted very soon after the webinar on the same link that you use to register for this page. The registration page will basically become your landing page for your webinar recording and the slides that we're going to post after the webinar, right? So if you have any questions, this is your answer. And a few more housekeeping items. You don't have to wait towards the end to ask any questions that you have. Whenever a question pops up in your mind, please feel free to use the question tab in GoToWebinar and post your question in. And what we'll do is we will do a Q&A session towards the end where me and Greg will try to get you answers for as many questions as possible pertaining to time. And if you have any further questions, if we couldn't get to, feel free to post on our developer.salesforce.com forums. So with that, let me hand over to Greg, who is going to take you through the agenda for today, where he's going to talk about how Lightning components evolved from the early days of Markup to the current metadata-aware based Lightning components, and a lot more as well. So over to you, Greg.
Okay, once again, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us on this webinar. What we'll be talking about today, I've got several different stops along the journey from Markup to Magic. We're going to start, obviously with some basics, just to make sure that everyone understands what we're talking about in terms of Lightning components. And then we'll talk about handling data, some of the new things that we have done around that with Lightning components. We'll talk about intelligent components, and then time permitting, I'll round out with a little bit of more component magic before taking your questions. But first, I want to start with just a big thank you. Not only thank you for taking your an hour out of your day to be with us today, but thank you for your commitment to Salesforce and to the Salesforce platform and being Salesforce developers. Because quite honestly, without you, our customers, our partners, Salesforce would be not a company. We wouldn't have lasted that long without any customers. So I want to thank you for that commitment and tell you that we genuinely appreciate you being part of our Ohana, part of our family. Now, I want to start by just looking backwards a bit. Salesforce started back in 1999. And in 1999, the web was a very different place. Building applications on the web was a very different thing. And so when we made the move to Lightning some 3 years ago, this Dreamforce will be the 3rd anniversary of Lightning, and when we announced it to you all and the rest of the world. And at that time, of course, there had been several years of work that had gone into making Lightning and getting Lightning ready to show you. But at that particular time, so let's just call it 5 or 6 years ago, as we began the journey towards Lightning, we stopped at Salesforce and thought, what would Salesforce look like today? If we redesigned it from the ground up, if we were to start out with a blank slate and we could do anything that we wanted, what would it look like today? What are the changes that we would make? And of course, those of you who are still back there on Classic and have to deal with Classic, come on, let's be honest. Classic looks a little old. I generally make the joke of 1999 called and wants its web application back because it looks a little bit dated. It doesn't look modern, and that was one of the first things that we thought about. But of course, it's not just about the look and feel. We'll talk about that a little bit more because it's the look and feel. Who cares really at the end of the day? If I'm getting my job done, then that's fine. Sure, it may not be the prettiest thing in the world, but I'm getting my job done. But you see, that's something else that has changed over the years. And that is, back in 1999, we were content to have just sort of a data entry model. We could just fire up a web page, enter a bunch of data, be done with it. That was all. That's all that we knew. That was all that was asked of us in terms of web applications. But as the web has progressed, of course, we know things like personalization and productivity are coming to the forefront. And so that is really what we wanted to represent with Lightning, is that new way of interacting with web applications. Not only personalization, but that absolute productivity and personalization combined, so that I, as an individual user, can execute tasks in a way that not only is personalized to the way that I work, but that also makes me more efficient. And of course, the UI, the interface to that, it's a big part of making me more proficient. And so that's where we started. We started in Lightning with the Lightning design system. And we began from the ground up to re-architect the UI, the interface layer of the platform, and of course thereby also of all of the clouds, Sales Cloud, Marketing Cloud, and so on. And so what we did with the Salesforce Lightning Design System was provide a framework that consists of HTML and CSS that provide or are able to provide a consistent user experience across all of the various applications. No matter what we're doing, everything looks the same. And of course, if I don't have to write CSS now, if I was in the room with all of you, I would ask you to raise your hands on who thinks CSS is hard. And I am sure that a lot of hands are going up right now, because CSS is hard for a lot of people. It is complicated. And if I don't have to write CSS, well, that's great. And that was one of the goals of the design system, was to provide these blueprints with CSS and HTML that made me not have to try to build that myself. And by doing that, it means that as you and I, as developers, embrace the Lightning design system and embrace Lightning components, it means that we are automatically upgraded every single time a change happens in the UI layer of the platform. And by the way, forward-looking statement, there's some changes coming in the Dreamforce release, in the Winter 19 release, to the CSS. So if you've been using SLDS, you're going to get those changes. If you've not, now you're going to be scrambling to try to catch up and make your components look the way that the rest of the platform looks. So I'd encourage you to dive into SLDS. We'll have a chance to talk briefly about SLDS a little bit later, but I would encourage you to dive into SLDS, especially dive into the utilities section, because while you may not need many of the component blueprints anymore because we've built base components that I'll talk about in a moment, you still need those utilities. And so it's a very, very important part of the design system. And of course, the framework. The framework is what we're going to be talking about today, the Lightning framework, and therein the Lightning component framework. And that Lightning component framework is what is driving the interface of the Lightning experience. Of course, there's a lot of things that underlie that, a lot of shared functionality and services in the core platform, as well as the interface and other aspects of development that you're going to see today, like the Lightning Data Service. So the nut is, I mean, when we really boil it all the way down, the Lightning experience is based around components. And components are literally everywhere. Everything that we look at in the Lightning experience is a component. Pop quiz. What's the largest component? What is the largest component that you can build? If you're answering right now a page, you're absolutely correct. A page in Lightning is nothing more than a Lightning component that just contains many more components. We'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But let's just make sure that everyone understands the basics of Lightning components. And let's contrast that to the previous way that we used to build, the previous way that we used to interact with Classic. You know, in the Classic world, everything was server-side. So when we called a page, that page was compiled on the server and then sent down to the client, already complete. Everything is finished. It's done, right? But that has a bad, or a downside, I should say, not bad, but a downside, a disadvantage. And that is, if I've got a table of data, for example, I've got a list view, and I want to change a single record in that list view, what is sent back to the server is ridiculous. It is the massive pages are getting sent back. Massive amounts of data are getting sent back and forth in order to update that little record that I just did as a piece of a list view. Contrasting that with the Lightning experience. The Lightning experience is component-based, as I mentioned, which means that on the right-hand side, you'll notice that there is 45 lines of code in that screenshot of the inspector. That is the page that you are looking at, 45 lines of code. Now, any of us have done front-end development know that that's impossible. That cannot be, that page cannot be represented by 45 lines of HTML. But you see, that's the component or componentized nature of the page in the Lightning experience, is that every component is its own little piece. It's its own little JSON that is being sent down independently of the rest of the page, down to the client, and then the framework is assembling all of those pieces together for us, which means that now when we interact with something, instead of having to send a massive payload, I can send just the little piece of data that has changed back to the server. Now, this is really huge because obviously less data, less bandwidth that I'm needing to keep up with. But it also means that I can do things on the client, and then I, as the developer, can decide if and or when I need to communicate those changes back to the server. So I could actually collect things on the server, have 3, 4, 5, 6 different things happen before I decide to send it back to the server, right? So this is a real complete and utter change in the way that we think about development. So let's break it down for you in thinking about that. What does that really mean for you and I as a developer? Well, let's break down the UI here. Now, here I have a typical sales path with a Kanban board. And, you know, as we look at this, we immediately just react to this as a single page, as a single big area on the page. But really, it's much more than that. If we just even take something as simple as the sales path here, that sales path, if I ask you, what is that? You would say, well, that's the sales path. I say, yes, but what is it really? What is it really? It's really a combination of components. It's actually 2 components that are reused over and over with values changing, that have been composited together to give us that overall sales path component, right? And this is the way that I need you to start thinking. I need you to start thinking in terms of components, in terms of building blocks, in terms of breaking things down into their smallest entities and then compositing or combining those back together to make these larger components, and even all the way up to experience components, and then all the way up to a page itself. Let's take something a little bit harder, the Kanban board, as I said. So looking at that now with that new frame of mind, how many components do you see? It's a little bit of a trick question, right? Because these components are all composited together. But let me help you out a little bit. If I broke it down like this, now how many components do you see? And if we really go all the way down to the individual pieces, it's really 6. There's 6 components, 6 different components that are being used over and over again. Their values are changing, obviously, but the components themselves are still the same DOM structure. They're still the same CSS. They've just been reused. And that's the other advantage to Lightning components, the reusability aspect. I can build things once and I can reuse them across other components or even across applications or entire orgs if I want. Because these components, when built properly, that means you and I, the developer, when we build these properly, we can actually add logic to make them contextual and make them adapt to their new surroundings. But of course, how many components do you need? I mean, to be a good framework, how many components do you need? And we asked ourselves that very same question when we set out to build base components for the Lightning framework, to build those UI components. We asked ourselves, how many do we need? We looked at React, we looked at Polymer, we looked at Visualforce. Visualforce, wow, 153 components in Visualforce. We looked at our Lightning design system. At the time, it consisted of 81 blueprints for components. And then we obviously also talked to you. We searched through the Stack Exchange. We came up with a good plan to begin delivering those components. We stack ranked them on what it was that you needed first. Pop quiz again. What do you think? Well, if you answered button, you're absolutely right. Button and input. Those were the 2 biggest ones. Those are the ones that everyone, of course, is using throughout Salesforce over and over again. So we started with those. In fact, in the first release, we gave you 22 base components. With each release, as you can sort of see, we've increased over the course of each release. You'll notice that I skipped over Spring 18. The reason I skipped over Spring 18 in the slide is because in Spring 18 we had 85 components. And so I thought it looked sort of silly if that graph showed 85 in spring and only 86 in summer. But that's to also let you know that, yes, my friends, I'm working as hard as I can. My teams are working as hard as they can to build new components. But sometimes I'm going to give you a lot of new components. Sometimes I'm only going to give you 1, or maybe even 0. I hope that'll never be the case. But we're doing a lot of work. We're doing a lot of work building new components for you, but also improving old components. And just to give you sort of an idea of what's out there, there's just a ton of things out there. And I just realized as I'm looking at this that there's a bunch of things that are marked there as beta, and I want to let you know what that means. First of all, that tab and tab set and formatted date time and formatted number, I need to remove the beta designator on that because with the summer release, we have removed their beta designation. They are now GA. Button menu will be GA very shortly. But what does that mean? Beta means simply for me that there's a couple of features or a couple of items that we are not entirely confident about. It doesn't mean you can't use the component. Please go out, use the component. It just means there might be something, it may be an accessibility aspect or an internationalization aspect or something like that that we've not been able to complete. And that's why I've marked it as beta. So don't be scared when you see that beta designation. Now let's talk about base components and what the idea behind base components are. One of the biggest complaints from folks coming to Lightning component development when they've been doing Visualforce is that, oh, I've got to do so much on my own. Well, that's the idea behind base Lightning components, is that, hey, in Visualforce, all I had to do was say Apex, page block table, for example, and boom, I have a table. Why do I have to go out and write a bunch of markup and a bunch of CSS on my own to do that in Lightning components? Well, with base components, you don't. You see, because that's our goal. That's what we are trying to do, is to give you all of these declarative tags, these declarative objects that you can use just like you were doing all these years in Visualforce. So for example, here's a component. This actually is a screenshot of the very first component that I built. Now, it didn't look like this when I built it way back then because, of course, a bunch of base components were not even available. This was the first component I built. This is almost its 3-year anniversary too. So back then, there were no base components. But today, I can build this entire thing out of literally just base components, because these base components are nothing more than declarative tags. So I can say, for example, Lightning card. I can tell it I want a particular icon. I want to tell you what the title is going to be. Or I want a button group, and I can identify the buttons that I want. Through those individual tags, what is actually happening is the framework is looking at those tags and converting those into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for me. I don't have to think about that. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have to write some additional JavaScript. I do, because I have to tell them, these components, what they actually are doing. But getting to that point is literally a single line of code. And of course, as I mentioned, with each release, not only am I giving you new components, not only are we looking to innovate and give you things that you've not thought about, or you maybe have been thinking about and been asking for, but we're also going back to the drawing board on each one of the existing components and adding in new functionality. A perfect example of that is in the summer release, our data table. One of the top requested features from all of you was for inline edit support. And so with the summer release, we have provided inline edit support, as well as Boolean column types. SVGs. You've wanted to use your own custom SVGs for your icons, and we've now provided that as well. And the list goes on. So just because you don't see a huge number of new components each release doesn't mean we haven't been working. We've been working very hard to make existing components even better, adding additional functionality. I have on my roadmap right now over 30 different enhancements to data table that will be coming in future releases, which brings me to, of course, the roadmap for our components. As I mentioned, in the spring release, we delivered a lot of new components. In the summer release, there was only that one new one. It's called Lightning Record Form. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But again, we also added a bunch of support for, added support for new features inside of existing components. For the future, we've got a lot of great things planned for you. Lightning Map is one that I'm excited about. It is the ability for you to literally put in a Google map into your components, as well as Lightning Charts, being able to take charts and create those out of Salesforce data or perhaps out of your own data. And we don't care. And just integrate those as well. So a lot of really cool things coming in the future. But let's go back to talking about today. One of the biggest things that I have heard is, okay, there's a bunch of great components out there. Where are they? How do I learn about them? Well, we've had something called the component library. It's been around for 3 releases now, and no one knew. I really am not kidding. It's been out there for a while. No one knew because we hid it so well. Unless you paid attention to the release notes, there was a single line talking about the release notes, several releases ago, saying, hey, we've got a new component library. Well, now we're proud to announce that we have actually moved that component library out into a place that you can find. I'm going to show that to you in just a moment, but also we've enhanced its capabilities to show you everything you need to know about each and every component available to you as a developer. And here is the component library. So the component library is literally just that. It is the ability for you and I to see what is going on with each and every component that is in existence. So we have, for example, the lightning section. That is all of our lightning namespace components. We have an aura section. We have a force section. And we have a UI section. These components, my friends, please do not use those. The reason that I ask you not to use those is those are about to be deprecated. We are beginning the journey towards deprecation for our UI namespace components. It's very important that you should know this, because what it means is that 18 months from the moment that a individual component is deprecated, we will no longer support you if you have issues with that. So how are we doing this deprecation? We are actually marking the support level for these individual items here in the component library. We will mark them as deprecated. You will see a note up here that will say these are now deprecated as we go through those individual components. And what that means is that you should then move away from those over into a lightning namespace component. Now, if we look at a lightning namespace component, you can notice, for example, I'll just take the first one here, lightning accordion. And what you're going to see is, of course, there's several different types. We can see the example options here. We see a basic accordion. We can see an accordion with a conditional section. We can see the markup necessary to generate that. We can also, where relevant, see controller code so that you know how to make the interactions with that component actually work. You can find the complete documentation here. That means you no longer have to download the PDF for the developer's guide anymore if all you're looking for is the reference material, because this is exactly where we are going to be putting it from here on out, as well as the specification for that given component, all of its attributes. If there were methods, those will be exposed here. If there were events, those would also be exposed here. But how do you find this? Well, all you have to do is go to developer.salesforce.com. Let me just go back over there to that, actually developer.salesforce.com is where I wanted to go. There we go. So let's go to developer.salesforce.com and go to the resources section, and right there is that component library link. So by going there, again, I will return right back to the place that you just saw me at. But here's the real cool part. If you notice, there's a login button right up here. If you log in to your org while you're in the component library, then in addition to Lightning, Aura, Force, all of the namespaces over here, you will see your own namespaces. You will either see C or for generic components, or if you are namespacing your components, you will see your own namespace listed here. So you will actually be able to go in and explore your own components. Well, that means if you've been a really good developer and you've actually written documentation for your components. Whoops. Yeah, that's right. We've got to start writing documentation for our components, you and I as a developer, because it's going to show up as part of the component in the component library. Okay, with that, let's head on over and look at a component very quickly, because we've got several more demos that I want to fit into the next 20 or so minutes here. So I'm going to start in my app. I'm in the Dreamhouse Lightning app. Dreamhouse is our fictitious real estate company. They use Salesforce to help manage properties and brokers and all of that kind of thing as they're selling houses. And of course, if you've not seen Dreamhouse before, you can go to the dreamhouseapp.io. You can actually download all the resources necessary for you to actually explore the Dreamhouse app itself. Now, there's a few things that I've built today that will not be in that app. I'm going to share those with you right now. So I'm going to start with this card right here, this little piece of the page, pointing out that our broker is Victor Ochoa. Now, what I want to do is I want to go and walk you through the evolution of this component, because right now, as it is appearing on the page, is the way that all components initially were built. Let me just go over here into my code editor. That's right, I'm going into VS Code. I'm not going into the developer console, because I use Salesforce DX. If you've not checked out Salesforce DX, I would encourage you to do so. It will literally change the way that you work with Salesforce. And what I want to start off with is this is just a very basic component. You see we have a few attributes up here. We have a handler for the init of the component. And then we have some markup. This markup is very basic at the moment. It's a Lightning card. And we've got a div inside of it giving us some padding. And then we got some more divs, and we got a UL and an LI. This is the way that we built our components when I started 3 years ago building Lightning components. Everything was done by HTML, by hand, by you and I as developers, creating all of this ourselves. Now, the Lightning design system gave us a little help when they provided us classes and CSS that we could apply. So we could apply things to an individual item, like this SLDS list item, or for the grid system, SLDS size 1 of 1, and so on. These things are all of the SLDS classes that we can apply to our HTML nodes, but also to base components that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So this is why I would encourage you to take a look around at the SLDS site, look at the blueprints, see what is available to you. Because if I've not built a base component for you, you're going to need to go to the SLDS site and grab the blueprint for what you want to build and modify it yourself. All right, so how did this data get here? Well, as I said, I have an init event that is happening, and that init event is over here in my controller. And in my controller, we can see that I just defined an action here in my init event that I'm going to go off and fire the get broker method on my Apex controller. My Apex controller is just going to pick up the record ID from the property that I'm on and go out and select all the information by first getting the broker's ID and then passing that off and then getting his name, their email, phone, mobile phone, picture, and so on, right? And returning that back down to my component. When that is returned back down to my component, it is actually going to be stored here in an attribute called broker. And that is what we're using then to display things. So for example, you can see I'm displaying broker.picture__C, broker._title, name, phone, and so on. So this is the way that we have been building things up to now, right? But you might have noticed there's a problem. It says broker for, and it appears that there's something missing here off of my card. Because what I'd really like to do is to say, this is the broker for this property, this 48 Brattle Street that I'm looking at. But that's not there right now. How do I get that? Lightning Data Service. So let's talk a little bit about handling data and the magic of Lightning Data Service. So what is Lightning Data Service? Well, let's think first about what is the flow of components on the page without Lightning Data Service. If you have 5 components on a page and all 5 of them are requesting some information from a single record, so they want to know something about the same record, but they're 5 individual components. In the past, that would mean that init control or that init method in our controller would have to go out and call to the server 5 different times. And those 5 different calls would be instantiated by each individual component on its own. If that data changes, all of them are going to have to go out and request that same data again. That's a little bit ridiculous. So that's where we started out with Lightning Data Service, because Lightning Data Service provides sort of the gateway. It's a gatekeeper. The gatekeeper that says, hey, do I already have this data? If I already have this data, then you don't need to go get it. You can just use a copy of the data that I brought back. I'll pull it out of my cache and I will give that to you. Now, the other nice thing about Lightning Data Service is that it all happens without even having to write a single line of Apex. That's right. I can simply pass a record ID to the Lightning Data Service and it will go out and retrieve the relevant data for that particular record for me. If another component on the page asks for the same record or any piece of that record's data, then Lightning Data Service will hand that off to them. So what does that mean? Well, like I said, no Apex. It also means we don't have to worry about authentication. And maybe the best part, no limits. That's right. We're not counting against your Apex limits because we're not using Apex. That's absolutely great, which means it's really highly performant because we're also going to cache that. So if again a second record is request or a second component requests the same record, we don't have to go anywhere. We can give it to them instantaneously, and that gives us consistency in our data. So what does that look like? Well, what it looks like is this. This is a full-on force record data tag with all the attributes exposed. You normally wouldn't do this, but I'm showing you all of its attributes just to show you what is possible. So what do we start with? Well, we start with just force record data and its Aura ID here, in this particular case, property service, right? But the important part is that we're going to tie our force record data to some attributes. For example, record ID. We're going to pass the record ID to that force record data. Once we do that, that is what initiates the retrieval of data. So that force record ID, or force record data, excuse me, it's going to receive the record ID. It's going to say, hey, I need all of the data from this particular record. When that data comes back, we're going to take it and we're going to populate either a target record or another target fields, which I'll talk about in a moment. And that is going to be the data store for that data on the client. And we can access that within our controller code, within our JavaScript, within our markup, by simply accessing the attribute .fields.price.value. Or if we're using the target fields instead of target record, we have a little bit more shorthand. We don't have to give the fields and the value attributes. We can just simply say, go to property fields and give me the price, right? Now, that's really cool. But even cooler is the fact that we then can ask force record data to start watching that. And for that particular record, if any of those fields that we're watching are updated, we can then ask the record to respond, or the controller to respond and do something about that. We can either ask for layout type full, which means that we are going to get all of the record, all the fields that are on the full layout, or the alternative is layout type equals compact, and that gives us the fields available on the compact layout. Or additionally, I should say, we can then choose to edit those through the mode equals edit attribute. Now, oops, and I'm sorry, I had one last one here that for some reason did not come in. Let me go back up here. There we go, sorry. We also have the fields attribute. The fields attribute is a list of fields that we want. So if we don't want to use layout type equals full or layout type equals compact, I'm only interested in 4 fields, I can list those 4 fields. Or I can combine the two. So I could say layout type equals full, but I have one field that's not on my layout. Let's say, thumbnail, for example. That's not normally on my layout, but then I could say layout type equals full, fields equals thumbnail, and then we will combine both. So we'll give you all the fields from the full layout plus that thumbnail that you asked for in the fields. All right. So finally, something new coming down at the pipe in a future release is something called a cache invalidation, because the one downside to Lightning Data Service is that we're caching. Now, I thought I just said that's a positive. Yes, it is a positive, except it's a downside, because what happens if I'm requesting some data and some other user has just updated that data, but my force record data, my Lightning Data Service has cached that record and says, well, I don't need to go back to the server because I've already got a cached version of that. Well, that's problematic, right? Because you're not going to know that somebody else updated that record. Well, coming very soon to a org near you, we have push data cache invalidation. So this animated GIF that's running here is actually showing you data changing on one and then automatically updating in another user's browser. And so that is going to be a huge, huge step forward for us in terms of two users working on the same record being notified that another user has updated their data. And that is going to be part of Lightning Data Service. I can't show that to you today, but I can show you Lightning Data Service. So let's head back over here to, oops, not there. Let's see, there we are, to my org here. And in my org, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to this same same component. And that same component, I'm going to go back over here. And I'm just going to undo or uncomment a little bit of code here. This is my force record data that I've got right here. And I'm going to just take that and move it down. Is that actually what I wanted to do? There we go. So I'm going to uncomment this very first force record data. It has a ID, a property record. It is getting the record ID from the record that we're looking at. It's putting all that data into our property attribute, and it's bringing back all of the items. Now, when I save this, I'm going to push this up to my server, and once it has been successfully pushed up the server, once again, the magic of SFDX, I'm going to go ahead and reload this component here, and we can see that our component, in just a moment, once the page has reloaded, is now saying it is broker 48 Brattle Street. So how did it know? It actually was able to pick up the data. And this was without going to the server. You saw that I didn't change anything. All I did was simply say, hey, here's the record ID, and now let me display the address. Now, what does that mean? Or the name, excuse me, for the property. That means if I now go in and I change this, and I just say this is Brattle Street, we're going to abbreviate it. I'm going to save that. You'll notice immediately here in my component, it was updated. So it saw that. Without having to go to the server, the component itself saw the change in the data. Now that means we can get a little bit more creative. I'm going to go back over to my code here, and we're going to comment out my init. Now I'm going to comment out the init. I'm going to save it. I'm going to just prove to you right now by, first uploading. Let's go ahead and upload. And once we have pushed up to our org, then I'm going to refresh here. And now when I refresh, you're going to see that my component no longer looks good because all of the data has disappeared. Just to prove to you that there's no smoke, there's no mirrors. This is not, well, this is magic, but you don't know what the magic is just yet, right? So let's go back over here again. And I'm going to go and uncomment this next force record data. And I'm going to go into my controller, and I'm going to uncomment a few items over here in a method that I have here. So let's talk through what is actually about to happen. So this record, when it actually sees its record ID, it goes out and it retrieves all the fields. But then when they come back, that is considered an update event because the record was empty and now it's full. And so it's going to call an update broker function. That update broker function is then going to go out and find my broker record. The broker record is my new force record data here. And it's going to store all of its data in the broker field, right? And you can see that it's using both the layout type full plus that field attribute, as I mentioned to you before. Okay, so once it has stored that, it's going to then go ahead and reload that entire record here based upon the data that we just received back, the ID for that broker, right? So what are we doing? We're dynamically assigning the record ID to this new force record data, which triggers the retrieval of the data. So let's push all of that up. And now, as we do, once this has been pushed up, we're going to refresh our org again. And with that refresh, we're going to see that now our data has come back. But wait a second. Remember, I commented out the init. So we are not talking to Apex. So the only way that we are getting this data is through force record data. Now that's magical. I am just really in awe of force record data. I've been loving it since we released it. But let's talk about how we can take a step forward with force record data. And the way that we can do that is through intelligent components. You see, because we can combine that Lightning data service with base components. Now, those base components are now becoming more and more metadata aware. So one of the goals that I have in our component roadmap is for you to write as little Apex code as possible. So here I have an example of a new metadata aware component called Lightning Record View Form. But the idea is that I can pass it a record ID and let it do the Lightning data service on its own, so that I again don't have to write any Apex in order to retrieve this data. Now, what does it look like? It looks like this. So there's two. There's Lightning Record View Form. We released that in winter last year, so winter 18. And then there's Lightning Record Edit Form, both of which are doing exactly as their names imply. They are creating or rendering forms for you. One is a view-only form, and one is an editable form, right? So this is really magic, because if you pass a record ID to a record edit form, we will actually go and retrieve all the data for you. If you don't pass that record ID and you only pass an object API name, we will actually create this as a form to create a new record of that object type. So again, you don't have to do any work other than just to provide that one tag, the input fields, output fields that you're interested in, and then of course a submit button in the case of the edit form. And then let's make it go even better, because view form, edit form, that's great, but I had a thought. Why not just combine them together and give me a record form? Record form is the single new component in the summer 18 release, and that is the combination of those two other components. And again, it is as a single line of code. But let's go take a look. We're going to do that by going back over here to my org. In my org, we are going to go back over here to this component. So let me just open up my code editor. And now we're going to go and comment out a bunch of code. We're just going to take all of this code, comment it out. And now let's uncomment this line of code. Now, this line of code just says see broker details, because this is one of the things that I want to talk to you about. All of this markup that we did up here, this was a markup that you and I did on our own, right? With maybe we went to SLDS and we got some classes and all of that, but we put all this together by ourselves. This is one of the issues that I started thinking about early on in my development, is that I usually would just build it all out like this, not thinking about encapsulating things into components themselves, beginning to think in a component-based architecture. So what I've done, instead of putting all of this into my main component, I've actually broken it out into its own component. So the body of my parent component is going to be comprised of simply a child component. This child component, I've actually gone in and replaced its markup as well. You'll notice you're not going to see any HTML tag at all here. You see, because what I'm using is all base components for this child component. I'm using that record view form. I'm passing in the record ID to that record view form, telling it is of type broker. Then I'm using our Lightning layout component to begin defining my grid of my layout items, telling them how big those items are going to be, how much they're going to fill out. And then I'm going to begin going all the way down to the individual input or output fields themselves. And those output fields, all I have to do is just simply say this is an output field, and what is the field name that I want to put here. Now, I've also got, if I scroll a little bit further down here, a record edit form. That record edit form is the exact same thing as the record view form, except it is now input fields instead of output fields. And what we're going to do here is I have an edit record button icon here for each of my my component, so that when I click on that, we're going to do an edit record. The edit record method is going to do nothing more than fire a helper method that is doing a simple show and hide. So it is simply going to show the view form and hide the edit form, or show the edit form and hide the view form. All right, so let's go ahead and, actually let me save this over here first. Let's save our updated component. Let's push it back up. And now we're going to notice that when I refresh, we are going to see really nothing has changed as it were. In other words, we are getting our data just as you see back here. Now you'll notice that the layout is a bit different because now it is relying on the layout that I defined in my record view form. But if I go in and I say, let's go ahead and edit this, and I click on that edit pencil, it is actually swapping out the view form with the edit form. So I can now just add a Z to this gentleman's name here, and I'll say go ahead and submit that. And you can see that now, sure enough, we have updated that data. How did we do it? The beauty of that force record data integration into the record edit form is that for a record edit form, the only thing that we need to do is to add a button with a type of submit inside of the record edit form, and that is it. There is literally nothing more that we have to do in order to save that record. So we can create, read, update, and even delete if we wanted to without writing Apex for those individual records. All right, so that's cool, right? That was really cool. But we can go one step further. And that one step further is to say, all right, instead of writing all of this code, I mean, this is a lot of code to have to write, right? Instead of writing all of that code, let's go back over here. Let's comment that one line out, that child component, and let's uncomment this bit of code here. I'll save it. We'll push it back up so that I can explain to you the code as it's going back up. First thing I'm doing is just checking to see, did we get an ID back? So did Lightning Data Service bring back that ID? If it did, now we're going to ask for only a record form. That record form is then going to receive again an ID, or sorry, a record ID. It's going to receive the API name. Tell me which fields that I want. Now notice here, these fields, this looks like it is calling an attribute, and it is. That attribute is right here. That attribute is a string array. That's the important bit, is this must be a string array. So please do not try to just add in a list of fields into the record form. You need to add this as a string array, so do it as an attribute as I've done here. Now, you'll also notice, whoa, what is this? I can actually specify columns. I can say, do I want a single column? Do I want multiple columns? Do I want this to be automatically in view mode or in edit mode? That's up to me, the developer. So let's go back over here. Let's refresh this one more time. And once we have done that, you're going to notice it's going to look very much the same as it did a moment ago, except now I can just simply go in here. We'll make another edit and we'll save. And there we go. We have just saved again a record. Nothing was needed by me, the developer, other than a single line of code. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's amazing. So I'm only ever going to use that thing, the record form. Well, you're probably not. Let me tell you that the reason I tell you this is because we now have Lightning record view form, Lightning record edit form, and Lightning record form. When should you use which one? Well, if you want for us to do all the heavy lifting, for us to lay out all of the fields for you, just in an arbitrary 1 column, 2 column, 3 column layout, whatever, use record form. If you don't need any control other than just give me the data and let me update it or whatever. But if you want any control over it in the layout or this, doing specific things, for example, maybe you want to do in fact, I had done that. You might have noticed there was a pop-up earlier that occurred that I forgot to comment out in my code. there was a little pop-up that popped up here when I had clicked out of the name field, and that was because I was actually doing in that record edit form, I was actually doing an on focus out. So I was saying, when I tab out of that, maybe I want to do a validation or something like that. That you can't do with record form. You have to use record edit form. So again, record form, we're going to take care of it all for you. Record view and edit form, those are the ones that give you, the developer, the control. All right, so let me show you one more thing. I'm going over here to my contact dashboard and go ahead and load up my data table. Again, I mentioned we've added in for the summer release inline edit. So if I want to go ahead and promote Sean here, I'm going to go ahead and promote Sean to the CEO now. You'll notice as soon as I have lost focus on that field, we're going to highlight that, telling you that that field has been changed, expose the save and the cancel button for you so that you can go ahead and have the data table save that change. Of course, you're not limited to a single one. If you wanted to change a couple of things, let's go back and we'll make this person an executive vice president, and we're going to make this person a senior director. With each one of these changes, what we're actually doing is we're actually storing these in a dirty value attribute so that you know what has changed and that you then can act on when you click that save button to save those changes, right? Now, I just changed 2 different records at the same time, but I also can go in and say, well, what about if we were to, we've had a update to our telephone system, and so we're going to need to update a couple of different phone numbers. I don't want to have to go in and do each one individually, so I'm going to choose my 2 individuals here that have the same phone number. I'm going to go in, I'm going to say, I want to change this to 99, and I'm going to update both of the selected values and apply that. And you can see both of those values have now changed as well. All right. And of course, I can tie that data table together. So here I've got a record view or a record form again. So if I wanted to go off and I wanted to edit an individual record, here we're passing the data from our data table back over to our record form. And I can say that Ms. Gonzalez actually prefers to be called Professor, sorry if I can get the right thing, Professor Gonzalez. And so we're going to go ahead and update that. And you'll notice that as soon as we do so, that record has in fact been updated. Okay. And of course, if I wanted to close that, maybe even make a new, reopen it, make a new record, I could do that as well if I did not have that filled out already as an individual record. Okay, so creating, reading, updating, deleting, all with a single line of code here with record form. All right, finally, and I know we're about out of time, I just wanted to talk very briefly about some more component magic that has come here inside of the summer release, and that is Lightning navigation. Important. We now are changing, we're deprecating and changing a bunch of the ways that you and I have navigated for a long time. Things like force navigate to object home or navigate to S object, navigate to related list. All of these things are changing now to the new Lightning navigation model. This new Lightning navigation model allows me to navigate to custom tabs, knowledge articles, or even directly to a component, provided that I am going to provide the page reference. So I'm going to say, where am I going? What type of page am I going to? What is the object name if I'm going to a standard page, for example? Do I want to pass any state or any variables down to that page or that particular component? Because yes, I can actually add Lightning is URL addressable to my components so that I can navigate directly to these components in our Salesforce mobile application or directly to a tab or a sub-tab as well. So with that, there's one last thing, and that is the Quick Action API. The Quick Action API allows us now to call a quick action directly from a Lightning component. And let's go have just a 2-second demo here. I'm going to go back over and I'm going to go into another part of my org where I have an opportunity open. And you'll notice that I have a lightning navigation in summer 18 component here. And I'm going to say navigate me over to a lightning component. By simply clicking that, boom, I have navigated directly over. This is just my very simple, silly component here. I have navigated directly over to a different lightning component straight from that button. Now, the other thing that I can do is, again, go ahead and I'm going to set a quick action. I've got a quick action up here called update opportunity, but I don't want to have the user to have to go up there, then open that up, fill out the information, and then save that. I want to just do it all in one go. So I'm just going to click my button here. You'll notice everything is happening for me. Boom, 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 boom. That quick action just fired from my own Lightning component. So as you can see, there is a ton of new stuff in the summer 18 release. There's a ton of new things that we're doing in the Lightning component world. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Satya and Shashank and let them wrap us up and take us into Q&A.
That was fantastic, Greg. So much of information, so much of new stuff coming up on Lightning. This is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing so much. We do have a link to the demo that our event attendees can actually try out what you actually saw. Greg has been kind enough to share the code with us. We will also be posting the link in the chat so that you can maybe bookmark it and start it and stuff. It's a GitHub repo in a Salesforce DX format, which is even better. And there is also this yeah.
Yeah, that first link for the summer demo, that is that data table and record form. And then that second link is actually the broker card is part of a project that I've just published on Trailhead. So that's the final step if you want to look at that the broker card that we would just walk through. So that's where that is found.
Well, there you go. A lot of stuff for you guys to try out and stuff. All right. So even though we are out of time, we have a lot of questions, Greg, a lot of interesting questions that we got. We'll take some time to at least answer a few of the questions, and they can take the rest of the questions to our forums or maybe tweet it out or something like that. So are we ready?
Yep. Do you want to just pick a few for me? And I'm sort of looking at them. You just fire one away. Go for it.
Yeah, I'll just fire some questions to you. All right. So there are a lot of questions around the use of UI namespace versus Lightning namespace, and what should be the focus of developers who are already using some of the UI namespace components, and what should be like a strategy for the future, or since this getting deprecated, what should be the strategy for the way forward?
Right. So basically, you need to do the same things that our internal teams are doing. As we have made these new Lightning components, we are the base Lightning components in the Lightning namespace. With each one, we're now going back through. We're going to check for parity, making sure that the Lightning namespace component does the same thing that the UI namespace component does. But when you start seeing those deprecations popping up, then that's where you're going to need to just swap them out. Swap out your UI input with Lightning input, for example, and go from there. That's you've got 18 months to do it from the moment that we deprecate that. Now we're not going to deprecate in between a release, so there's going to be a few that you're going to see being deprecated starting in the winter release. So you're going to want to watch the release notes as well as the component library as we begin to make these deprecations happen. Once you see that in the release note, let's say for UI input, for example, if you see that as deprecated in the winter release, that means you now have 18 months to go through the process of swapping that out with a Lightning input. And that's just what you need to do.
Okay, so let me just add a bit. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Greg. So It's not that all these UI components will be deprecated in one surprise release. There will be some
Right.
components which will be deprecated in a particular release or something like that, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's we have you know 100 different components out there, and so we're not able to just sweep the board in one go. That would be ridiculous. That's a lot of work, not only for us but for you, the developers out there in the community. So yeah, it's going to be a gradual rolling process. I would say over the next 2 to 3 releases, we should be at a point where all of the UI namespace components will have been marked for deprecation. So that will mean that they will be on their 18-month path to no longer being supported. Now that doesn't mean that necessarily that something is going to quit working completely. I mean, during that 18 months, everything is exactly as if as if the component was not deprecated. But once we do reach that 18-month period, depending on the component, either it may stop working or we just won't support you if you have support issues around that component.
All right, that's great. So there's one interesting philosophical question for a developer. So what's more important for a developer? Is it CSS, markup, and JSON handling, or is it business logic, event handling, and Apex controllers?
Oh, you're right. That's a philosophical question. That's for sure. I would say that for me, as a Lightning component developer, very much it is an understanding of JavaScript, an understanding of CSS. You don't have to be great at CSS because SLDS has given us a lot of classes, but you do need to have a basic understanding of how CSS works, just so that you can apply those classes or understand. Okay, I apply this class and then I apply that class and something different happens, right? Due to the cascade or the combining nature of the styles. But I would say JavaScript, absolutely 100%. And then, Apex, of course, we're always going to need some Apex. I was showing the magic with the Lightning Data Service. I rarely write Apex for a single record anymore, but I very definitely write Apex when I'm needing to get bulk records. If I am looking to go out and get, all of my contacts who are part of a particular company or in a particular, region or something like that, one of those types of queries, whenever we go into that query aspect, I definitely have to write Apex. So I definitely am still going to need to understand how Apex is done, how Apex is written. But hopefully over time, we'll make that less and less of an issue for you.
All right, fantastic. So there's one more very popular question that we keep getting when we meet a lot of developers working on Lightning. Is there a base component for lookup somewhere there?
I hate you all. No, so yes, there is, but no, there's not. Uh, so what does that mean? That means in record edit form, well, record view form and edit form for that matter, but in record edit form, if you have a field that is a lookup field, so you say input field, field name equals, account, for example, let's say account on a contact, right? That's going to be a lookup. So the moment I do that, then that is a lookup field. We know that is a lookup field and we will turn it into a lookup field. What we do not have is a standalone Lightning, input type equals lookup or, Lightning lookup component. And the reason for that, and believe me, I feel your pain, I feel your frustration, but I've been going around and around with folks. There's a idea on the idea exchange about this whole thing. If you feel strongly about it, go vote for it. It's got a couple thousand points right now for a standalone lookup component. But I will tell you this, that's hard, because what a standard lookup component is going to need to know is, where am I going? What is the relationship of the lookup? And if I give you a standalone component, that means you're going to have to write that logic. So that's sort of where our challenge is at the moment, because lookups are not easy. And so we're still in a debate about, do I want to make you have to write that kind of logic for you, and or can I get closer to a finished, or closer to a point where you would not have to write as much. I can't tell you what the future holds. I can tell you that, it is an ongoing discussion. But again, there's been no commitment at this point.
All right. So we'll take one more question since we're almost out of
Sure.
time. So there are some questions around how many components can you actually put on it on a page, whether be it base components or experience components, and how many times can you actually use Lightning Data Service on a page to ensure good performance?
So how many components can you put on a page? That's sort of a, how blue is the sky kind of a question. If I put 100 components that all they're doing is saying hello world on the page, there's not going to be a performance impact at all. But if I'm putting 10 components on a page that are doing some massive work, retrieving, doing lookups and data mashups and all of that kind of thing, yeah, the performance is going to, degrade. So that's sort of a hard question to answer, other than to say, think about that as you are building. One of the things I can tell you, just in standard Lightning pages, Lightning experience page, when you go to any record detail page out of the box, if you've not customized the page at all, when you go, I had this very same question when I saw my first Lightning page. I said, why is it every time I go to a record page, I have to click on the detail tab to see the details? Why am I getting all this related tab as my default? And the reason is we're trying not to load things that are in tabs. Only the tab that is exposed is the selected tab is the one that loads first and loads. Everything else is lazy loaded as you select the tab. So you should be thinking about that same architecture in your components. In other words, think about how that component is going to be initialized. Think about what data it's going to be trying to display, and try to think about how can I architect this so that the data payload is either faster getting to me, or I break it up into multiple retrievals or something like that before I overload a component with just everything that I want it ever to possibly do, and I do it all at the initialization phase. Now, in terms of Lightning Data Service, you can use force record data. I don't know that there is a limit to the number that you can use. I've never had to use more than 2, but because if you're starting to use 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, start asking yourself, wait a second, why am I doing this? Because what it could mean is that you want to break that up into a child component. You want to have that new item, that new force record data actually be a part of a child component. And if you look at that link in that Trailhead project, there's a component called the similar properties component that we build, and we take you through that. And we actually use 2 different record datas inside of the overall component, but one is in the parent and the second one is in the child. And the child is then iterated over multiple times. So, that it's being smart about your architecture.
All right, that's pretty much a wrap for today with the Q&A. Feel free to post other questions as well. Thank you so much, Greg, for taking your time.
Absolutely.
What time is it right now? Like 12:30 p.m. or something?
It's 11:45 p.m. But don't worry, I have a glass of wine sitting right here beside me that is waiting to say hello. So I'm going to call it a night.
All right. Thank you so much. You have a good night, and thank
Absolutely.
you, everybody. Yeah. Thank you,
And
everybody.
I look forward to. Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
look forward to seeing you all. Yeah, hopefully, knock on wood, hopefully I'll be out to India soon to visit you all, maybe India dreaming, if not before. So we'll look forward to that.
Yeah, we are already looking forward for you to come down. And thank you so much for taking time. And thank you so much, everybody, for taking your Friday morning. And it's 15 minutes beyond scheduled time. And there's so many people still hanging out and listening to our questions and answers. Thanks a lot, everybody. And until next time, have a nice day.